Alright, fellas, I'm going to talk a little bit about another 90s bodybuilder. I did a little video on Paul Dillette a while back, but one of the other guys in the 90s who was real popular, did well for himself, was Chris Cormier. Chris was well known as having outstanding genetics, the full muscle bellies. He was a competitor, guy that competed a lot. He was, in the 90s, these guys competed a lot. They were in the magazines. I mean, back in the day, the internet was just starting off and starting to pick up steam. And back then, you bought magazines, and then these guys were the guys that were in the magazines. They didn't really let themselves get too dramatically out of shape because a lot of them competed a lot. So when you did see them, a lot of times they were looking pretty damn good. But Chris was one of those guys with superior genetics. He had just a classic physique. I mean, these guys still had the lines of a classic physique, but they also had great mass and conditioning. So sometimes they didn't seem to sacrifice a ton of size to look more like a classic. I mean, look at this vacuum he's got going on. That's sick. Chris was, I suppose, he's 5'9", probably 240, between 240 245, around that size. So almost perfect size for a bodybuilder, to be honest. Not incredibly massive and freaky, but definitely not small, where you still had the cuts and the shape and everything like that. But Chris was a stalwart, as I said, in the 90s. Competed in a boatload of shows. I think his last show was 2007. He actually placed first in 2005 in the San Fran Pro, which is pretty good. He was going to go over and train with Dorian Yates, but actually had a life-threatening type of injury. I think that actually left him paralyzed for a little while, so we had to come back from that. He had an infected spine, which is pretty crazy. I've never heard of that before, but and included, or he had to have extensive physiotherapy. So I think I read an article too where he had to learn to walk again, maybe something like that. That's pretty nuts, but you hear that, it's bodybuilding. A lot of these freaky injuries these guys get. But Chris, he was always one of the top guys. He was always a threat. Never won Olympia, obviously, but I think he might have placed second one year in the Olympia. But he was right up there with, these guys. It was always the same amount of guys. Real depth back in the 90s. That's a great pick. He was just one of those guys that was always right there. So you had to be on the top of your game. Back in the day, I mean, those are great picks right there. And he's also, if I'm not mistaken, he also might have almost gotten in a little dust up with Mike Tyson. I think Mike Tyson saw him in a restaurant or something and slapped him along those lines. I'm not sure someone can help me out with that, but Chris obviously didn't do anything back. I mean, Mike Tyson back then was like Godzilla. I mean, he was at the peak of his, legendary status, even though I think he'd been beaten at that point, but he was still Mike Tyson. So here's another pick. I mean, look at those lines. That's crazy. Not huge, I mean, compared to today's guys, but back then that was a complete package. So respect to Chris Cormier. I think now he's a guru, a la, like a Charles Glass kind of guy. Helps guys get into shape, and from my understanding, he does a very good job of that. Trains them, probably gives them advice on the minerals, whatever it is, but he's supposedly making a pretty good career for himself out of that. So that's good to hear. He recovered from his illness, sickness, or his injury, whatever it was, to come back and still have a career in bodybuilding.